What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Fed Up Church. I'm Pastor Sean Finney, and this week I want to talk to you about emergency exit rows on airplanes. What? All right, so if you've ever flown on a commercial aircraft, you're probably familiar with the emergency exit row, right? That's the row that's got the door out over the wing, or a door that if the plane crashes, the slide pops out and people go out that way. But if you've ever flown, you've either seen people face these questions by the flight attendants, or you've been questioned yourself. Like, are you willing and able to uphold the duties and responsibilities associated with flying in the emergency exit row? Most people are like, yep, because they want the extra leg room. But most people don't realize what that comes with, the kind of responsibility that carries. So I want to talk about that for a minute today. And thinking about it, there's only one row of seats on an entire aircraft outside of the pilot seats that have very specific laws in the books. And it's the emergency exit row. In order to be qualified to sit there, like, you want the extra leg room, I guess. There's no place to put your carry-on luggage. I never wanted to sit there. I'm a short guy to begin with. I'm like 5'8", so I don't need extra leg room. I need storage space. But I once found myself facing that. I somehow got seated in the emergency exit aisle. And the flight attendants come up and they ask me, are you willing and able to assist in the event of an emergency? Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I'll do what I can. I didn't realize what kind of laws actually are required to be followed there. Like, you got to be at least 15 years of age to fly in that aisle. You have to be at least able, strong enough, mobile enough, dexterous enough to assist other passengers out the door. I knew that much. But you have to have a visual capacity to be able to see and read and understand the instructions you're reading. You have to have the oral capacity to be able to hear what's going on when the flight attendants are shouting commands to you in the event of an emergency landing. And you have to be able to articulate those commands that are being shouted to you, to your fellow passengers, to get them off the aircraft safely. Now, I found myself in the same situation, only not on an aircraft. I found that the same thing happened when I took my seat in church for the last time. I coincidentally found myself with this responsibility to read, to communicate, to assist the other passengers on this aircraft, this vehicle that we call the church. Instead of a plane, it was a church. And both the engines were on fire. The pilots were ill-prepared, and the flight attendants were obliviously toxic. To make matters worse, we somehow were heading in a direction that was never intended, and we were losing altitude fast. Now, most plane crashes are absolutely catastrophically fatal. The same can be said for most churches. So the question becomes, how did we get into this situation? And how do we get out of it? Why are there fewer frequent flyers today than there's ever been? And how is it that your kids spotted the engine trouble before you did? Are planes crashing? And I'm Pastor Sean Finney. I'm your emergency exit passenger today. Let's talk through it. Now, the idea of an emergency exit reminded me of the story of Exodus. Moses leading God's people out of Egypt and to the promised land. So I think we need to talk about Exodus tonight, but not that Exodus. Not that exit. But the one that's happening right now. The emergency exit that's happening in your home. And in most churches today. Okay, let's talk about the science behind Genesis. So this is something that a lot of people have requested that I speak on, and it's a passion of mine. So I'll start a short series kind of going into a lot of the basics of what I had to come to terms with and the struggles I had as a neurobiologist and a Christian, and how that translated from problems I had with Genesis into problems instead that I had with the church and the church's lack of teaching on this subject. Now, why does this matter? Like, why is this even relevant? And another question that comes up is like, is this going to be a good sermon? This is not a sermon. This is not a message as much as it is classes in session. So it matters because 75% of children raised in church will abandon those beliefs after they graduate high school. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. You have 100 students in a graduating class at a Christian school, which will be a massive Christian school. The average attendance is 169 for a school, the entire school, for private Christian schools in the United States. But say you have 100 kids graduate. 75 of them are going to deny and reject their faith after they graduate. That's terrifying, but not all too unpredictable. More than half of all college professors go on to view evangelical Christians unfavorably. I experienced this myself. Like I said, I went to a public school. I went to Penn State. And as a biology, a budding biologist, biology major, they looked at that and looked at the cross around my neck and went, something's going to have to change. Either change your career or change your belief systems, because that worldview is not compliant with a neurobiologist. That just doesn't work. Or so they said. And I got laughed at and mocked and ridiculed. And I mean, it's ridiculous. It's actually, it's impressively stupid. Now, if you think about Generation Z, right? These are the people that were born, these kids were born between 1995 and 2015. They call them Gen Z. They claim atheism at rates double that of the current adult population. Nearly half, 46% of them, say they need actual factual evidence to support such beliefs. Half of the church-going teens, so even these kids that are raised in church, say that the church seems to reject much of what science tells us about the world. 49% of them. And they're not wrong. That's the problem. 27% of church teens say that the teachings they are exposed to in church are just, and I quote, shallow. Most American churches overemphasize emotion, and they ignore the biblical command to develop your mind. If you go to 1 Peter 3:15, and I'll read from the New International Version, 1 Peter 3:15 NIV says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But," and this is where we stop reading in most churches, "do this with gentleness and respect." So always be able to give an account for why you believe what you believed. Justify it, defend it. Modern Christianity will call this apologetics, like being able to defend what you believe. But Peter said, always do that with gentleness and respect. In 2 Corinthians 10:5, it says we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. It's kind of hard to demolish arguments when you're not even aware of what the arguments are, or you haven't even studied anything below surface level. If you're that typical church-going individual, or, dare I say, the typical pastor out there who's just preaching a happy, good, feel-good message, or the opposite, because somehow that makes it better, nothing but fire and brimstone, and not actually educating your congregation, can you really blame them for saying it's shallow and there's really not a lot to learn? They don't get exposed to anything of value and substance so that they can demolish arguments? If you can't say that, then that's part of the problem. The engines are on fire and we're losing altitude fast. And we're doing a great job. The American church, well, we do a great job of putting on skits and plays and performing for the youth. But we do a terrible job at informing them with logic and reason and truth from a Christian worldview. especially when it comes to the scientific perspective on it. This is extremely lacking, and I don't understand it. I never did. I never understood when I would ask a question from a scientific perspective, why I would get shut down in churches. I had pastors look at me and go, well, that doesn't matter because this is what the Bible says and we don't talk about that. Like science is some kind of cuss word in churches. Science is the study of how things work in our world around us. That's it. It's not meant to be a discussion of origins. That's philosophy, that's religion, that's not science. Science, you have to be able to apply the scientific method, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But if you think about it, the average private school, I said, has like 169 students, the entire school. In 10 years, 130 of them are going to be an atheist because we have failed them. The pilots are drunk at the joysticks. We are ill-prepared and ill-equipped, and that's why I'm starting this series this week and digging into this, because this is what I struggled the most with as a scientist, with my Christian set of beliefs. So, unlike Moses, we're seeing a mass exodus of people away from God instead of to him, towards the promised land, out of slavery. The exodus is in reverse, and nobody's talking about it. So why are we seeing such a large amount of believers go away from the truths that are in the Bible? And the answer is simple. We haven't convinced anyone that this book is true at all. We haven't tried even giving it any merit. Nobody's willing to question the Bible. I've heard preachers say, don't question God. Why not? Jesus did. My Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Right? Thomas did. And everyone calls him Doubting Thomas. But Doubting Thomas gave me the most encouragement because I'm a man who's a skeptic until I can test it with my own eyes and my own hands. And that's what Thomas said. Unless I see him pierce through the side and where they put the nails through his wrist, like I won't believe. I have to touch it. Jesus didn't condemn him for it. He shows up and goes, here's my side, touch it, feel my wrists, right? Like, test it, validate it. There's nothing wrong with asking questions, and God will give you the validation you need if you're willing to put in the work and actually test it. He says, test me, prove me, and see if I'm wrong, right? Like, he says this multiple times throughout the Old Testament. And Jesus says it multiple times throughout the New Testament as well. Faith is not meant to be blind. He didn't go around and blind a single person. Paul did, but that's a different story. But Jesus didn't. He went around opening blind eyes. So at no point are you ever called to have blind faith. That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Oh, you just got to believe it. No, you're a moron if you believe everything somebody tells you without actually doing the research and testing it yourself. That just makes you an idiot. That does not God gave you a brain to use for a reason. So please apply it, use it, and let's actually dig into a lot of these and kind of expand on and explore both sides of the equation, both counter arguments, and see if what we're learning in academia, what our kids are learning in academia, holds any merit. And again, from a scientific perspective. This is not just going to be me going, oh, the Bible says it, that settles it, I believe it. No, it doesn't. Didn't settle it for me, doesn't settle it for them, and that's why they're all leaving the church. 1 John 4:1 says, Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 says, but test them all. Hold on to what is good. But test them all. So let's prove it. Let's test them. Let's see what the Bible has to say, what Darwin has to say, what biology has to say, what science has to say, and see who comes out on top. Most believers in the American church act like science is some kind of cuss word, and any kind of scientific discussion in the Bible, like of the Bible, is just reprimanded. It's shut down, it's squashed by the leadership in most churches, by the congregation. It's sad, but I've seen it. I've experienced it personally. And it was one of the reasons that I, for years, believed everything in the Bible except for Genesis. Oh, yeah, so what? It's just Genesis. But as long as you believe the rest of it, the other 65 books are good. No, absolutely not. A problem if you don't believe in Genesis. If you believe like I did, like, oh, that's the Santa Claus for adults. Play devil's advocate for a moment, right? Literally, if you wanted to bring down a building, where do you set the charges? Or if you're going to demolish a building, you set the charges in the foundation. If you want to undermine an entire belief system, you set the charges in the beginning, at its foundation, in Genesis. If you're not convinced that Genesis is true as written, then that means there's no original sin. If there's no original sin, there's no need for a savior. If there's no need for a savior, the entire thing is null and void. Without Genesis, none of the rest of the book matters. None of the rest of any of the books matter. And we have sold off wholesale the scientific argument about Genesis. We haven't even tried to put up a fight. And it's killing our teens, it's killing our youth, and it's killing the church. And maybe rightfully so, because the church has turned into something it was never intended to be. It's turned into something it was never meant to be. It's turned into something that Jesus wouldn't recognize if he started his ministry today. Or he may recognize it because it sounds and looks and acts a lot like the Pharisees of his day. It just got a new face and a new name. If you don't believe Genesis, the cross is pointless. The cross is literally, as Paul says, made of none effect. So, and fear not, like teenagers are not alone on this one. It's been my experience that most Christians deny Genesis whether they realize it or not. And if you don't believe me, let's do a quick little quiz here. How old is the Earth? The current scientific answer to that, scientific consensus, is 4.5 billion years. 4.5 billion years. The biblical answer to that, if you're looking at Genesis, it's less than 10,000 years, approximately 6,800 years or so. But if your first response when I said that is no way it's that young, there's just no way. Like, we've got fossils and everything. Welcome to my struggle. This was the problem I had with Genesis. That's where I was. So hold on a minute and keep that thought. We're not done yet. As Paul said in Romans 14:5, and this is what I kept coming back to, he said, let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. It's not only a good idea for you to go through the thought exercise of, comparing one side versus the other and trying to sort out which one's truth, which one's fact, and which one's myth and legend and just a good story to put kids to sleep. It's not just a good idea. It's necessary. You must be fully persuaded in your own mind, or else what do you believe if you don't even know what you believe? It's like the Samaritan woman. Jesus said the same thing. You guys don't even know what you believe. Because their belief system was a set of this amalgamation of all these different religious beliefs. Judaism, pagans, all together as one. Bits and pieces of whatever they liked. Kind of like Christianity today. Bits and pieces of whatever we like, and none of the stuff we don't. But as I had so many questions when I was new in my faith that went unanswered for far too long. And it's not that I didn't ask them. It's that people refused to answer it. We answered instead with, catchphrases. I asked the question, how can Genesis be correct if fossils prove that the Earth is billions of years old? And when we answer young believers with the catchphrase well, the Bible says it, that settles it, I believe it. Or you answer instead with, I don't know, maybe you should pray about it. God help you. You're not doing your job. We are not doing our job if that's how we're approaching believers. We have a job to educate and disciple new believers. That's our job. That's a God-given job that you have as a believer in Christ, is to disciple, right? That's the Great Commission. Go forth and teach, baptizing all in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? The Holy Ghost. If we're not doing what we're called to do in educating and discipling, because that's what it means to disciple, it means to discipline, to train in a discipline. The same way I trained in scientific disciplines. This is what we're called to do. And we're failing at it miserably. Questions I asked, aside from fossils. Fossils prove the Earth is billions of years old. How can that be true if we know evolution explains the diversity of all life on this planet? Obviously, people don't live to be 900 and some years old in real life. Have you read Genesis? It's a book of good values, not to be taken literally. Just bedtime stories told to children, not fact. These were my arguments. And my wife and I would have many arguments. What cracks me up the most, and if that's not God carrying out his plan, I don't know what that is. For somebody who was raised in a church, raised Baptist, to marry a biologist. Two opposites, belief system-wise, two opposites. We would have arguments about stuff like this all the time, like debates. I say arguments, but we would debate stuff. And she was gracious and patient with me. And God's plan really comes through on that when you fast forward, almost a decade and a half later, and I'm preaching the gospel, the good news, teaching Sunday schools. That is something I never would have expected and something I never saw coming. But it's topics like this that I'm passionate about because I was so led astray for so long that we need to do a better job. Now, I don't teach Sunday school in a church anymore, and I don't preach not really. I don't really preach in churches anymore unless I'm invited to kind of be a guest preacher, which happens occasionally. But the reason for that is I can't do it routinely anymore. And I'll explain why I can't routinely get behind a pulpit and project lies. So if you're triggered, welcome to it. But stay with me, bear with me. There'll be a plot twist at the end, maybe. So that's where I want to start our conversation tonight. I want to start the conversation tonight in Genesis. Like I said, it's not a message, it's not a sermon. Class is in session. We're about to dig in deep because, like I said, from a scientific perspective, this is not going to be like elementary science. I can't do it that way. I taught this once to teens in Sunday school. I did an entire 3-month study going through this at my level. The way that I had to understand it, which was a collegiate level. Did they learn anything? I hope so. Some of them, you can see them, the eyes glaze over. So I hope that doesn't happen to you tonight. But if it does, feel free to take a nap, come back, and try again later. If we don't study, how do we show ourselves approved unto God? Right? 2 Timothy 2:15. So study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. You can't divide the word of truth if you can't study. And you can't demolish arguments unless you have studied. So today we're going to begin this much requested series in Genesis, Science in Genesis. And we'll pick up with, and I'm going to read from the King James Version for reading Genesis. Because looking at you Baptists, study what you preach before you preach it. Genesis chapter 1, King James, says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day." Here's the important part. I mean, it's all important, but this is the part I'm going to dig into tonight. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. What's that mean? Have you ever actually thought about it? Like, we memorize this, and we don't even know what it means. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. Now, I want to compare and contrast. Like I said, we're going to take a scientific approach. That is the first argument for the creation of everything. The origins of life. That's the one argument. Now, the second argument that I was kind of raised in, because I wasn't raised in a church. That I got saved when I was 17. Like, I came to understand and know who Jesus was. I was 17, dating my now wife, because that was her father's rule. You want to date my daughter? You're going to go to church. All right, fine, whatever. Lo and behold, it changed everything. So, props, Nick. Thank you. Now, to understand that, I'm going to read from chapter 2 of my biology textbook, my college biology textbook. And it's literally titled Biological Science. It's written by Scott Freeman. And chapter 2 is titled The Origin and Early Evolution of Life. First two paragraphs we're going to go into here. It says, to estimate when the origin of life took place, biologists examine fossils, traces of living organisms left in rocks. The most ancient fossils that have been found to date are in rocks that formed about 3.85 billion years ago. As figure 2b shows, these fossils consist of tiny grains of carbon. If you had high school biology, you probably heard of carbon dating. Although the grains do not contain cells or other direct evidence of life, a recent analysis suggests that the carbon atoms present were once part of organisms. Specifically, the isotope C12, carbon-12, is much more abundant in the grains than expected, giving the normal abundance of C12 relative to heavier carbon isotopes. If these carbon grains actually do represent the remains of organisms, see, we don't really talk about the verbiage here they use, if these actually do. Because you can't prove any of it. If these carbon grains actually do represent the remains of organisms, they suggest that life started just after the end of massive bombardment. The current consensus is that chemical evolution occurred during a fairly narrow window of time, perhaps 300 million years or less. Almost as soon as conditions on Earth stabilized enough for life to begin, it did. Now, chapter 1 goes into the depths of the story and the glories of a man named Darwin, Charles Darwin, who gave biologists one founding great idea to explain everything and how everything came into existence today. The problem is, Charles Darwin wasn't a scientist, and nobody talks about that. Nobody points out that fact, and we just ignore it. He wasn't a scientist. He was a clergyman in the Catholic Church. Like, literally got his Bachelor's of Arts from Christ's College in Cambridge. Dedicated his book to the Creator. And the book is The Origin of Species. And he wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a scientist any more than Bill Nye, the science guy, is a scientist. You know, the guy who has a mechanical engineering degree, a bachelor's, that's an aerospace engineering degree. It's not even biology. His first job out of college was working at Boeing, like with aircraft. Neither of them had any scientific training. These are the guys we're allowed to teach us science. I don't understand it. So which theory seems to bear more scientific weight? And what are they not telling you, though? That's the important part. We never talk about what we don't talk about. The things that we're not being told. They don't mention the fact that carbon dating is wildly inaccurate outside of a 2,000 year range. Like, you go trying to test something older than 2,000 years, you're going to get some wildly inaccurate numbers. They assume that the conditions on Earth were the exact same as they are now. Even though chapter 1 goes in depth on how the conditions of Earth early on were vastly different than what we see today. And I'll explain that why as we get into this series a little bit more when it comes to the details of carbon dating. But the quick and dirty rundown, carbon dating is basically, okay, all the things that have carbon, plants, whatever, they have carbon. Animals have carbon. All the cells have carbon. Carbon-12 is an isotope that has a very predictable half-life. It breaks down over time at a very predictable rate. You can literally set a clock by it. But if I'm whatever dinosaur and I eat, this bush or I eat this animal, I'm ingesting that carbon. And that carbon gets trapped in all of my cells, right? Because you are what you eat, literally. And over time, as my bones sit there and fossilize, I can take that, I can measure the amount of carbon that's in it, that's carbon-12, versus how much I expect to be in it based on current atmospheric conditions today. And I can calculate how old it is. That's the idea. That's the theory. But it is based on the assumption that you know exactly what the conditions were like in both time periods, today and the beginning. But it would have to be completely different to explain any of what we see today. So that doesn't make any sense. And if you start testing things outside of 2,000 years, like I said, you get wildly inaccurate numbers, which kind of helps their case. They really want to get to the point where you have billions of years, because you have to have billions of years for Darwinian evolution to be true. How does that work? It doesn't. Hopefully, enough years equals enough chance, and life happens. No one explains it because no one knows. No one even has a clue, including Darwin. He had dedicated like a third of his book to why his theory didn't make any sense and how it still breaks down, and that's why he didn't want to publish it. He did not want to have to publish his book. He was forced to publish that book. It was his life's work. He was a naturalist. He liked studying. He's like a bird watcher. Literally, the guy was like just a bird watcher as a hobby. And a way to get out of the church and take a vacation, get on a boat and go over here, and starts taking notes. Comes up with this idea. And we call him like the grandfather of biology or whatever. No, absolutely not. Now, microevolution, yes. Microevolution, I agree with. I have literally proven that. I've tested it and proven it. The fact that E. coli bacteria can become like antibiotic resistant. I've proven that in a lab. That's microevolution. The fact that you can go and lift weights for 6 weeks and increase your strength exponentially. Yeah, you can prove that. You can test that. That's microevolution. Macroevolution, things coming into existence from nothing, things then going on to evolve into all these different species. That's macroevolution. And it's a slight nuanced change, and that's all they need. No, the same logic applies, but no, the same logic breaks down entirely. And we need to talk about why. So, staunch evolutionist, Richard Dawkins. He was the guy who famously said, there is no God. Okay. Richard Dawkins dealt with the limitations of radiocarbon dating a few years ago in his highly proclaimed book, The Blind Watchmaker, where he's basically mocking this idea of God, saying different kinds of radioactive decay-based geological stopwatches run at different rates. The radiocarbon stopwatch buzzes around at a great rate, so fast that after some thousands of years, its spring is almost wound down and the watch is no longer reliable. It is useful for dating organic material on the archaeological/historical timescale, where we are dealing in hundreds or only a few thousands of years. But it is no good for the evolutionary timescale when we are dealing in millions of years. So why are we using radiocarbon dating to justify the age of the Earth? And that's all they can ever really use. It all comes back to that. All the assumptions that all of evolutionary theory is based on comes back to radiocarbon dating, even though we know that does not work. We just don't tell you it doesn't work from the academia perspective in science as a scientist. Yeah, we just don't talk about that. And we don't educate anyone in that. The general public does not know radiocarbon dating doesn't work past 2,000 years. Shells from living snails have been carbon dated to be 2,300 years old. They're living snails. And then we had another study where shells from living snails were dated as being 27,000 years old. Radiocarbon dating is wildly inaccurate. And a freshly killed seal in one study was carbon dated as having died 1,300 years ago. So all these, oh, it's the oldest, Homo sapien, the oldest man ever discovered on some mountain in a cave somewhere, frozen to death, is like 3 million years old, or whatever wildly inaccurate assumptions they just throw out there to try to justify, like, we've been around for a very, very, very long time. Makes you question all of that. At least it did for me. I'm like, well, if we're dating things that literally just died, we literally just killed this seal, and it's already saying it's 1,300 years old. The whole setup is sus. Whole thing's suspicious. So, why do we insist on using what we actually know to be wildly inaccurate data when it comes to aging the Earth? The answer is simple. It has to be. All of current evolutionary theory, all of it hinges upon having billions of years of time to supposedly result in spontaneous beneficial evolution of new, or what we would call in biology, novel species, or traits, new or novel traits in species. This, according to Darwin, the not-so-science guy. The problem with Darwinian evolution is many, and that's what I want to dig more into today. The whole thing's a house of cards, and we're not even playing the game as Christians anymore. We don't even attempt to try and dispel the myth and talk about these. So is it a surprise that the teens are leaving the church and their faith at such astounding rates? No. Doesn't surprise me at all. The majority of people are leaving the church for the same reason. If there's nothing of substance, if you're not getting fed anything of substance, think of it this way. If you are to go to your kitchen because you're hungry and you find in there an awesome meal, a big meal, a feast, it's Thanksgiving, you eat that and you feel full. You know you got fed. So you'll come back the next time you're hungry. Which, if you're like me, that's a couple hours. Constantly trying to get more. But if I'm hungry and I go into the kitchen and there's nothing in there, and the only thing that's in there is like junk, I'm not going back. There's nothing there. So why are we preaching messages like you have to be in church? No, you are the church. You don't have to be in church. You literally are the church. Christ is in you. The church is not a building. But people will preach this, and pastors will preach the fact that, oh, you got to go to church. You have to go to church. Commanded to go to church. No, you're not. Absolutely not. Nowhere in the Bible does it tell a sinner to go to church. Because church is a group of people. It literally means like entourage, posse, group of people. Jesus never went into a building and said, you all have to come in here. He went house to house. They did the same thing in the book of Acts, house to house, breaking bread with one another and discussing the scriptures, kind of like how we're doing today, house to house. Nowhere does it say you have to go to a church. But people will preach that. You have to come to church. Why? Because people don't want to come back. It's a constant struggle to keep the lights on if nobody's coming in. But if you're going to the kitchen and not getting fed, why would you go back? We're going to these churches and not getting anything of substance. If we're going to these churches and we're not getting anything of substance, we're not getting fed, whose fault is that? And you need to study the Bible on your own, and if you rely only on what the spiritual food is that the pastor gives you, the preacher gives you out of this book, then you're going to be malnourished. Yeah, you're right. Drastically so. You don't survive to the next week. If you're basing your spiritual sustenance off of what you're getting in most churches today, it's weak. And it's shallow. The teenagers are right. It's shallow. And it's not relevant. These are the comments I've heard when teens kind of graduate out of my class when I was doing Sunday school, and they didn't want to go to what they called big church. Like, the 18 plus, you're going to go to the regular church. They said it's not relevant. it's boring, it's shallow, and I learned nothing. I literally had my buddy and I had this discussion one time because these teenagers would just sit there with their headsets on in church, like the big church, big service. And at first I was upset. He was upset too. And he was like, we need to have a conversation with them. They can't be disrespectful like that, just listening to music during church. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I looked at him and I went, okay, we'll have that conversation with them if you can remember what was preached on. Because I can't. I can't recall a single thing that was talked about. Because none of it was relevant and none of it mattered. They're right. So I think we need to discuss the scientific process a bit. What is the scientific process? One, the first step of the scientific process is to ask a question. The second step is to do your research. The third step is to construct a hypothesis, some idea that you need to test. And then step 4 is to test it, to test that hypothesis with an experiment. The 5th step is to analyze the results and draw your conclusions, and then 6 is communicate the results. The problem, however, is that step 4, conduct an experiment to test your hypothesis, is literally not possible when you're discussing history. Therefore, both evolution and Christianity are both faith-based systems. And there are 7 assumptions to evolutionary theory we need to understand. Not as biologists, as Christians. We need to understand the counter-argument. And if your argument is, I didn't come from a monkey, you've already lost. That's never been the argument. And if that's your understanding of the argument, you've already lost the discussion. And that person's walking away thinking you're an idiot. And you know what? We all start there. Sure. Before I actually got trained in biology, I thought that we come from monkeys. No, that's never been the argument. So pay attention, learn something new, and actually be able to hold a conversation with these kids. The 7 assumptions to evolutionary theory are that 1, non-living things gave rise to living things. So things that are not alive produced things that were. Spontaneous generation only occurred once. So the second one is spontaneous generation of life only ever occurred one time. The third one is that viruses, bacteria, plants, and animals are all related. And the fourth one is protozoa, single-celled organisms, gave rise to metazoa, multiple-celled organisms. The 5th assumption is that various invertebrate phyla are all interrelated, and that invertebrates, things without a backbone, right? Things without a spine, things without these bones. Invertebrates gave rise to vertebrates. Things like you and I, who have a backbone. The 7th one is that for vertebrates, it was basically fish, led to amphibians, led to reptiles, led to birds, and led to mammals. Romans 1:25 says they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. The same thing is true today. That has not changed. So, how much scientific evidence exists to prove evolution, though? Like, have you thought about it? Because I didn't. I assumed the evidence was there because they keep talking about it. It's all based on assumptions, and none of it can be tested. Remember that. Scientific method requires it to be tested. None of it can be tested. But what we do have fits in a shoebox, not a museum. It literally fits in a shoebox. And the box used to be bigger, and then as our technological advances progressed in testing things and understanding what's in that box, they started coming out. That's not really a fossil. That's a pig tooth from the farmer next door. Like things like that. So they just keep chucking things out of this box. And Michael Behe is one of my favorite scientists, and he wrote Darwin's Black Box. One of the most influential books I've ever read as a young scientific Christian, because he was blacklisted from academia for coming out and saying Darwin's full of crap. And none of this scientifically makes any sense. I mean, he was a world-renowned scientist before this, a world-renowned biologist. And then he comes out and says this, and he gets blacklisted, and he's not allowed to teach in any universities, and they shut him down. But the man went through Darwin's black box, and it was everything that's wrong with evolutionary theory. And all the ways we can prove evolutionary theory, Darwin's style, is complete crap. But that's all they have to base this entire field of science on, so they're not going to get rid of it easily. Now, we'll dig into all these aspects over the next several videos and next several weeks. But first, let's see if there's any scientific support for Genesis, because I think we can sit here and all day long destroy the scientific aspect of evolution, evolutionary theory, Darwinian theory. But what no one ever really does is look at Genesis and ask the question, is there any scientific support? Remember, you still can't test it. Both of them are faith-based systems, but if I'm looking at 2 court cases and trying to decide which one's true, I'm going to evaluate the evidence. I'm going to ask, does any of it seem valid based on what I know of the world and the physics and the laws and how this works? No one does that when it comes to Genesis. So I want to do that. Now, if you looked at verse 6 in Genesis chapter 1, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. A firmament means an expanse. In the midst of the waters, in the middle of the waters. And let it divide the waters from the waters. An expanse that divides the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, divided the waters which were under the firmament, the expanse. So you got waters down here. And he divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, the expanse, heaven. In the evening and the morning were the second day. So we see here that God made a firmament, an expanse, in the middle of water, in the midst of waters, dividing waters from the waters. And the meaning that carries then is that the atmosphere would have been liquid water, not vapor, water vapor as we see it today. And if you study Hebrew and you actually go looking into the word that we have translated as heaven in verse 8, it's shemayim, or literally sky water. So when Adam and Eve and everyone before the flood would have looked up, they wouldn't have seen what you and I see today. And that sounds ridiculous. I get it. To say like, oh, they would have looked up and saw sky water, just an ocean up there and an ocean's down here. Sounds ridiculous. So in an atmosphere made entirely of water, is that even like possible? Is that even legitimate? Is there any kind of precedent for that sort of thing scientifically that we know of? Well, it's not as crazy as it sounds. So this one article I found, this one study that I was looking into was that, I'll read an excerpt of it here. It says, a nearby alien planet 6 times the size of Earth is covered with a water-rich atmosphere that includes a strange plasma form of water, scientists say. Astronomers have determined that the atmosphere of super-Earth Gliese 1214b is likely water-rich. However, this exoplanet is no Earth twin. The high temperature and density of the planet give an atmosphere that differs dramatically from Earth. As the temperature and pressures are so high, water is not in its usual form, vapor, liquid, or solid, but in an ionic or plasma form at the bottom of the atmosphere, namely the interior of Gliese 1214b. Principal investigator Norio Narita of the National Astronomical Observatory of Japan told Space.com by email. So reading through this, I'm like, so it's not unheard of. Like, we know these things can exist. Such a planet model is realistic. It's not as crazy as it sounds. Okay. But what would that look like? Okay, what would it look like if Earth had water surrounding it, an entire like globe surrounded by this liquid water? Well, we've actually done this. So there's a few actual Christian scientists that ran computer models and simulations of what that would look like and what impacts would that have on the Earth and life as we know it. The atmospheric pressure would be approximately double what we have today. Like double the atmospheric pressure. The oxygen content would be so much higher than we currently experience like 34, 33, 35% in that range. Oxygen content versus like the 21% we have now. UV radiation would be unable to penetrate it because UV radiation is not really going to penetrate a liquid water atmosphere. And the climate would then be like from North Pole to South Pole, all the way around. It would be like greenhouse warm. And that means lush vegetation everywhere. But we know that's not what we see now, right? Because you got like Antarctica, right? You look at these poles, they're frozen. You've got areas of desert. It's not lush greenhouse warm everywhere today. But it isn't possible to test an environment that nobody living today was around to see. But does the scientific evidence support it? Do we see evidence that could be true? So what are the facts? In June 2009, the United States Geological Survey discovered fossilized insects trapped in amber. Think Jurassic Park style. The resin of the conifer trees. In these samples, bubbles were frozen in time within the amber. And that enabled them to kind of get a peek into the atmospheric conditions existing in ancient times. And what they discovered was that apparently dinosaurs breathed oxygen-rich air, about 35%, compared to our 21%. Okay, that explains a big mystery we've faced in science for a long time. One, how do you get a reptile that big? And how do they survive? Like, how do they breathe? Okay, the average dinosaur had nostrils the size of a horse. They couldn't take in enough air to support that body size. And we know that pterodactyls existed, right? We have their fossils. But the problem with a pterodactyl is it couldn't possibly fly in our atmosphere. So what's with the wings? Like, the atmospheric pressure is too low for it to get enough lift. They were just simply too heavy. Their wings wouldn't be able to generate enough lift against the light air that we have today. Well, analysis of their fossils actually revealed that the atmospheric pressure was about double what we see today. So there might be some credit to this pole-to-pole greenhouse warm covered in liquid water model. If it predicted double the atmospheric pressure and increasing oxygen content from 21% to closer to like 34, 35%, and all the evidence and all things we can test, that's what it's saying we see. So already we have more evidence to validate the claims made in Genesis chapter 1 than we have to validate the claims made of all of evolutionary theory to date. This was mind-blowing to me this may be boring stuff for some of you, but this was mind-blowing to me. And because this is something I struggled with so much, and I've had a lot of people request that we discuss this, yes, the science and the numbers, and I may lose you here or there. But you have to understand this in order to be able to demolish arguments, hold conversations, and be fully persuaded, every man in his own mind. So, a system with high oxygen and high atmospheric pressure, that's what we're figuring out here. So there was a high atmospheric pressure, high oxygen content. Okay. We have a name for that. If you've ever done any kind of athletic sports, right, or had an injury, burn victims, things like that nature, yeah, this is not a new term. Hyperbaric, right? High oxygen, high atmospheric pressure, hyperbaric chamber. It's what we use to like speed up healing at nearly miraculous rates, right? So you could heal from injuries and illnesses and much faster, so much faster in a hyperbaric chamber. They're expensive. But if you have a sports injury and you need to heal very quickly and you've got the money, you go into a hyperbaric chamber. High oxygen, high atmospheric pressure. If that's what hospitals are using to heal burn victims that otherwise would die because they can heal faster in that environment, I want to ask you a question. So scientifically speaking, how old are you? And you may be like, oh, I'm 30, or I'm 40, or I'm 50. But are you? Like, scientifically, we know there's not a single cell in your body that's older than 10 years old, right? So every decade, you're replacing every single cell in your body. So you may be 60, but there's not a single cell in your body that's even a teenager yet. So how do you explain aging? We all know we age, we get older. The problem is, and everyone will say, well, it's DNA mutation. That's our current theory. But even that's only a theory. And if you actually push any biologist on it, they will admit we don't really know how aging works. We just know it happens. And you'll find that that's the answer to a lot of what we call science. And we claim these things as fact. Kind of like Pluto's a planet. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. I don't know. Science changes with the current body of evidence that we have and our understanding of it. It's unstable. But Genesis has been the same for a very long time. The mechanism for aging is not completely understood, even now. We know that one factor is involved, right? DNA mutations. And DNA mutations are caused by pretty much one thing, radiation. Whether that comes from UV radiation or nuclear radiation, nuclear meltdown happens and you grow like third eyes or whatever. Not really, but you get the gist. It causes DNA mutation, and your body's normally really good at identifying these mutations and fixing them as you age, but it gets less and less effective at doing so. So some of those get through, and those mutations get through, and that's how you end up with, like, you get wrinkles, you get grays, you get changes to you, and you age because you're less effective at repairing these mutations because they're happening with increasing regularity. Now, if we don't understand aging, but we understand that it's caused by UV radiation, and the Genesis account talks about there being like water above, water below, and scientifically we know, okay, that would pretty much eliminate UV radiation, create a hyperbaric environment, then yeah, current science indicates if you could live in a hyperbaric chamber, absent UV radiation, your lifespan could be upwards of 1,000 years. If you could somehow create an environment that was hyperbaric, if you could somehow eliminate UV radiation, 1,000-year lifespan would be normal. What do we see in Genesis? So, like, follow me. Like, chapter 5 is like that chapter everybody skips. Like, it makes no sense. So you just go like, yeah, no, people didn't live 900 and some years old. And so-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, so-and-so. And each time it says they lived to be 912 years old, 905. The average age was 912 years old in chapter 5 of Genesis. And we blow past that thinking, well, they must have counted years differently. But no, even in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, a year was 360 days. So that doesn't even do the math. They're still hundreds of years old. It might not have been 912, it might have been 910, but still, you understand, like, this rocked my understanding of biology when I was like, because this is why I thought it was a story. It was made up. It was just, nobody lives that long. It doesn't make sense. We've never seen anyone live that long that we have record of it. Not thinking we have freaking record of it in chapter 5 in Genesis, because that's what it was. It was a recorded account. Now, how's it not made up? Maybe errors in translation. It could just be a made up story. Prove it. Okay? What do we see? I'll put up a little graph here, a little chart. Okay, so you see the patriarchs listed here. And Adam lived to be 930 years old. Seth, 912. Enosh was 905, and that goes 910, 895, 962. Enoch was 365, and it says translated because he was literally like, that's where God like translated him up into heaven. He's the one that didn't die. And that's Genesis 5:23. But Methuselah was 969 years old. Lamech was 777 years old. Noah, 950 years old. Again, the average age is 912 here. During the 1,000 years following the flood, however, the Bible records a progressive decline in the lifespan of the patriarchs. From Noah, who lived to be 950 years old, until Abraham at 175. In fact, Moses was actually unusually old for his time at 120 years old, because when he reflected on the brevity of life, he said in Psalms 90, verse 10, the days of our years are 70 years and 70. And if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. So if the flood eliminated this protective liquid water atmosphere. Because if it literally talks about like the flood happening, like it was a global flood. And we've tried to justify this, certain areas of Christianity by like, well, it wasn't global. It might have been like a local flood. It flooded their world. No, the Bible is very clear. It's a global flood. It was basically like this global collapse of this atmospheric water, just because it never rained before that. Like, you have to understand, they didn't know what rain was. So when Noah's told to build this ark before the rains come, what are the rains? They have never seen rain. They have seen mist, right? They talked about like the mist would come up, which is what you would see in that environment if it was covered in a liquid globe of water. It would be like a greenhouse. You'd end up with all this condensation, and that's how things would become so lush. But rain coming down from the sky water? No wonder he built the boat, right? Like, that's going to come down. I'm building it, dude. We got it. But if you look at this, like if the flood eliminated that protective barrier that prevented UV radiation from getting through, it eliminated the hyperbaric effect. So you end up with atmospheric pressure half of what it used to be. And you end up with a lower oxygen content, 21%. Then we should see this natural decline of lifespans moving forward. And we see that, put it here, Shem was 600, then it goes down 438, 433, 464, 239. Massive drop at this point. 239, 230, 148, 205, 175. It's significantly declining. Look at the graph. Graphing these patriarchs over time. Man's maximum lifespan today is like 120 years. And our average life expectancy is still only 70 to 80 years, just as it was when the 90th Psalm was written 3,400 years ago. Not much has changed since then. This precipitous plunge in lifespans after the flood suggests that something changed at the time of the flood or shortly thereafter, and it was responsible for the decline. This line graph of this decline reveals something we know of as an exponential curve, specifically an exponential decay curve. The exponential decay rate is often called the natural decay rate, and because it's so often observed in nature. But for example, this is the decay curve that you would see when living organisms are exposed to lethal doses of radiation. So since it's unlikely that people around Noah's time knew about exponential decay rates and natural decay curves upon exposure to radiation, it's highly unlikely these dates are fabricated, these lifespans are fabricated, because it fits exactly what you would expect to see in a model where you cut the hyperbaric effect, the oxygen content got reduced, and the atmospheric pressure got cut in half. And you introduce UV radiation for the first time. This is what you would see. Now, interestingly enough, and everyone talks about Noah getting drunk. Okay, the man made wine before the flood. He made wine after the flood. He made wine the same way after the flood as he would before. Right? He only knows how to make wine one way. So he makes his wine, and all of a sudden, the atmospheric pressure is half of what it used to be, and that alcohol ferments a lot faster. So when he's drinking his wine and getting lit, just straight up wasted, this is why God didn't rebuke him for it. He had no idea to know that he was making some super potent stuff at this point, that it was not like that beforehand. Everything we see in Genesis makes sense when you consider the scientific aspect of what we are seeing recorded in these first several chapters in Genesis that nobody likes to pay attention to. Evolution has a difficult time explaining aging and lifespans, and it's often aging is viewed as the default, but genes are selected on the basis of how they benefit an individual in their young reproductive years, or the warranty period, so to speak, which is the time required to fulfill Darwinian purposes, right? The Darwinian purpose of reproduction, having successful reproduction onto the next generation. However, those same genes might actually be harmful overall, leading to aging and eventual death. So Darwinian theory has a problem when those are the genes that are actually being selected for. It kind of disproves the whole idea of Darwinian evolution. So what about that fourth expectation of this greenhouse effect? Is there any scientific evidence to support that idea? Such an atmosphere would lead to warm, lush, greenhouse type environment everywhere, vegetation everywhere. Do we see any evidence for that? So we know that two things are required to produce an abundance of natural oil on Earth: lush vegetation and decomposing animal remains. A lot of it. But the largest oil fields that we see on Earth don't tend to take place in these lush environments, right? They tend to take place in these desert, dry, arid areas like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East that we're always fighting over the oil. That doesn't make sense unless it wasn't always that way, right? Otherwise, you're not going to have an abundance of natural oil unless you have a lot of decaying vegetation and decaying animals. Animals, sure. You look over there, there's animals. Not a lot of them. There's not tons, right? Not like you go to South America, like Brazil and the Amazon. But still, they have animals, but they don't have lush vegetation. No. So how do they have natural oil at the levels they have it? Obviously, it's clear. It didn't always exist the way it is today. They had to have a lot of lush vegetation in order for that to make sense. So again, this was just an introduction, right? I just want to get you thinking. I want to get you questioning these things because, okay, if you think about the poles and the Arctic and these areas where they don't have explanations for these things scientifically, we have found entire forests frozen in the tundra areas in the Arctic. And you read about the woolly mammoth that was frozen right in where was that, Russia or something like that, in these frozen tundras, but they don't talk about the entire fields, the entire forests that have been frozen. They don't talk about how these, we have seen massive mudslides, these volcanic eruptions and things triggering massive mudslides that completely cover a forest. And that was 10 years ago, and the entire forest is petrified and fossilized because scientists will argue you can't produce a fossil that fast. But we know it's true. We were around when it was there, and we were around when the mudslides happened, and we are still around now, and we're testing it, and it's a freaking fossil. So that doesn't hold up either. It doesn't take long to produce fossils. Everything I thought I knew about science broke down. And I had to reevaluate one key point. And that's what I want to get you thinking about and reevaluating and asking the question. The key point of your buzzword for the next little while is going to be assumptions. What are my assumptions? What assumptions am I basing this belief on? And everything's a belief. Whether it's a fact or not, it's irrelevant. It's a belief. You either believe the fact to be true, you believe it to be false, or whatever. But it's something you believe to be true. What are you basing your assumptions on? Again, like I said, this was just an introduction. I'm going to go into a lot more depth, but I'll give you a little taste of how deep we're going to go today. You can decide if you want to stick around and actually see how deep and sketchy and twisted and scary the rabbit hole goes. But there's more scientific data to support the first 8 verses of Genesis than there is to support all of scientific evolutionary theory today. So why do we lie in academia about a lot of these things? And I think Hitler summed this up best, right? Because the scientific consensus is that these things just can't be. They just can't exist. These frozen forests and everything, they just can't be. Radioactive isotope halos, things that we're going to talk about, digging into rocks and geological formations, they just can't be. That's the scientific consensus. That's just not possible. But you're holding it in your hand there, bro. It's real, so explain it. Well, they can't. And we lie about a lot of these things to our youth because we don't understand it. But I think the reason why we lie is even bigger than that. And when I say we, I'm talking about academia and the scientists that practice these disciplines. Hitler summed it up best. He wrote, I'm going to read 2 quick paragraphs here to you. And he says, all this was inspired by the principle. Remember, this is Adolf Hitler. All this was inspired by the principle, which is quite true within itself, that in the big lie, there is always a certain force of credibility, because the broad masses of a nation are always more easily corrupted in the deeper strata of their emotional nature than consciously or voluntarily, and thus in the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more readily fall victim to the big lie than the small lie, since they themselves often tell small lies in the little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously, even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their minds. They still will doubt and waver and will continue to think that there may be some other explanation. For the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down, a fact which is known to all expert liars in this world, and to all who conspire together in the art of lying. In other words, if you tell a lie big enough and long enough, people will eventually believe it. Academia and atheists aren't the only ones lying to you, though. Christian churches do it all the time. Put a finger down challenge. Let's try it. We'll end with put a finger down challenge. Put a finger down if you've ever heard these in a church. Women shouldn't wear pants. Men should wear a shirt and tie. How about you shouldn't drink alcohol? Or tattoos and piercings are not Christian. How about rock music is evil? Or you must give money to the church, and if you do, God will bless you for it. How about homosexuality is an abomination to God? How about you shouldn't hang around sinners? How about science is the opposite of faith? And how about Sunday is the Lord's Day? All of these are false. None of them are biblical. And you may be able to find some references to some of these in your altered King James Bible, but none of these were supported or taught by Jesus, and nearly every one of them require you to do some pretty amazing freaking mental gymnastics and twist one verse out of context in order to get there. So if you find yourself thinking there's something wrong with the engines on this plane that we're on, you're not alone. They've watered down the jet fuel, the pilots are drunk, they've forgotten their heading and our destination, and they don't know how to fly the plane anymore. It's about time we started studying the manual to learn how to fly this thing ourselves. I'm just the guy in the emergency exit row here to help you get out of it alive. I got sick and tired of all the lies and just got fed up with these lies being preached. I couldn't stand behind a pulpit and preach them myself in good faith, knowing that these are lies too. So welcome to Fed Up Church. Join us each week as we continue to expose the truth behind the lies and misconceptions of modern Christianity and science. And like, follow, and subscribe if you are interested to see what heaven looks like without religion. I love you guys. I'll see you next week. Thanks for joining.